If this story moved you, stay to the end and consider subscribing for more true-to-life stories of community rescue and hope. The handlebars gleamed under the low sun like a promise, chrome catching the grid of the street. Inside the Iron Stallion clubhouse, the smell of oil and old leather sat heavy in the air, threaded with coffee and the faint, sharp tang of metal. Maya stood in the doorway, small as a shadow, one eye swollen, a smear of dirt on her cheek where fingers had missed a tear. In her hand she clutched a folded school program, Career Day, Roosevelt Elementary, printed in block letters. Her voice when she spoke was almost swallowed by the rumble of bikes idling outside. "Can you be my parents today?" she asked, looking up at the two men by the door, as if the weight of that question might be light enough to lift on their answer. Diesel looked first, tall, jacketed in patched leather, the club insignia, a winged stallion, stitched over his heart. His face was the calm that came after storms, a mouth used to making decisions and a patience earned the hard way. Bull sat beside him, broader than the doorway, knuckles like small knots of wood, and a mouth that softened with a memory. Between them, the younger members, Snake, Ghost, Wrench, hovered, a chorus of curiosity and guarded warmth. They had seen broken kids before, but Maya's quiet lit something raw in Bull. He had been a boy once in a house where voices broke like glass. He reached out, fingers hovering a half-inch from the bruise on her temple and then falling back. He did not touch without permission. The old instinct to seize and fix had been tempered by a lifetime of learning to listen. "Why us?" Ghost asked, as if the question needed asking. Outside, a quartet of stallion motorcycles idled with the steady pulse of heartbeats. Inside the clubhouse, children's drawings were pinned beside wanted posters and old racing flyers, odd companions that had become family on the walls. Maya blinked. "My mom said bikers were scary. But you have a patch," she said, straightening the paper in her hands, "and you ride. My teacher, she said people who show up are what family is. I only need one day. Will you show up?" The question landed like a small bell. Diesel let the silence do some of the answering. He could see the program, Career Day at Roosevelt next Friday, the schedule penciled with a tiny star where special guests would speak to second graders. It was the kind of public thing that could be either a spectacle or a stage for dignity. He had the image already, kids looking up at them, leather and chrome, and a girl in the front row whose eyes would no longer be filled with the shock that made her ask to borrow parents. "We don't do this for the show," Diesel said slowly. "We show up because someone called us to. We don't become what we fight against." Bull's voice came out rough with feeling. "You know why I do it?" he said to Maya, then to Diesel, then to the room. "I was that kid. People looked at me like I was trouble. Someone stayed. That's why I'm still here." They took the question seriously. It wasn't just sentiment. There were lines to draw and work to do. The club had rules for a reason. They were guardians without uniform, a measure of mercy and an accountability to the town. They had seen grudges become cycles. They had chosen, often with their fists, to end cycles, but always with a sense of where justice belonged. Tonight they would plan. Tomorrow they'd gather facts. Wrench and Snake left the clubhouse with quick, efficient steps. Vance, Derek Vance, was a name whispered up and down the neighborhood. A man who took and promised and then took some more. Rumors were dangerous like that. Truth was slower. Ghost came back minutes later with what a cell phone could tell him in a polite city. Landlord notices, a thin record of past arrests for debt collection disturbances, a work history as patchy as a winter coat. Nothing explicit about violence, nothing that would make the law move on its own. But Maya's black eye sat like a ledger entry that didn't require a full report. Visible, undeniable. Diesel listened to the fragments. He made a call to a principal he trusted, keeping his voice low, giving facts without theater. The principal's tone shifted when Diesel used names instead of hints. Schools could act when adult pressure met official concern. Social services could be moved from a bureaucracy to a force if the right doors were nudged open. Diesel knew how to nudge. He used his voice as brass did, solid and carrying weight. They met the next day in Diesel's backyard, old lawn chairs around a rusted bar, bikes forming a ring like a placard of intent. Bull told them what it had been like when someone had shown up for him. Not the rescue movies make of violence, but the daily small things: steadying presence, listening, helping with paperwork, driving to interviews, waiting on benches during meetings. It wasn't the kind of heroism that made headlines. It was the kind that kept someone from drifting into worse things. "We don't go in guns blazing," Diesel said. "We go in with a plan. We call what's needed. We make sure the kid is safe while the law does its work. If a man needs to be shown the consequences of his debts and his choices, that'll happen through exposure, through the truth. We don't make ourselves judge." They agreed on limits: no threats that crossed lines, no bloodletting, no private punishments. The club had scars from times they'd crossed those lines and vowed never to again. Instead, they would use their presence as pressure. They would arrive at the school in uniformed numbers to reclaim Maya's dignity in public. They would notify social services. The police would document concerns, and they would confront Derek Vance with community witnesses and an offer, not a bargain, but a clear map of the paths ahead: restraining orders, legal consequences, employment help if he chose accountability. Bull looked at Maya and then at Diesel. "We tell the truth loud enough that the town hears," he said. "We make sure she doesn't have to tell it alone." They rehearsed the script of their intervention like coaches going over a play. Snake would prearrange a meeting with the principal and social worker, making sure the school had a safe room and a plan for Maya. Ghost would compile the public records, eviction notices, debts, any official points that would show pattern. Diesel would speak to community leaders and gain their quiet assent: a therapist on retainer to take an emergency consult, a local temp agency willing to look at the mother's resume, and a legal aid contact who could file for a protective order swiftly. On the Thursday before career day, Bull took Maya out to buy a new sweater. It was a small, ordinary Mercy. She chose a blue one that made her bruise look smaller under the collar. Bull bought a pack of chocolate muffins from a bakery that smelled faintly of almonds and butter. They walked slower than Bull's usual stride. For Bull, the walk was a confession in motion. He kept his sentences short, letting past and present touch. "You know I'm not a clean-living man," Bull said, watching Maya tie a ribbon on a muffin box. "But being bad a long time teaches you how quick you can be to be kinder. That's the thing. Sometimes the people who'd hit first are the ones who learn to hold hands last." Maya nodded like she understood the weight of those words without knowing the whole grammar of them. She asked if Bull had a son, if he'd been there when he was small. He admitted he hadn't, and that it had cost him in ways he couldn't list. Maya put her small hand on his rough knuckle as if to mark the silence as company. Friday dawned bright and a little too clear. The Iron Stallion ride to the school was a pageant of noise and chrome that the quieter streets hadn't expected. Diesel's bike started with a sound that vibrated windows. Children pressed against the gym windows as the bikes parked in a tidy line. Mothers pulled phones out, not always with smiles, some with the protective flinch that happens when the world shifts in front of you. Inside the gym, the fluorescent lights hummed with the small chaos of chairs and fidgety second graders. The principal, who had taken Diesel's call seriously, met the stallions at the door and led them to the front where a folding table waited, a microphone perched like an afterthought. Diesel's voice was steady when he spoke to the assembled school, words chosen to be simple and to the point. He spoke about choices and about being present, about how each person in that room could be the kind of adult who showed up. Bull's testimony followed, short, honest. He said enough for the children to hear that adults can change, that people who hurt can also be helped, but only if others keep watch. Maya sat at the front, palms clenched in her lap. She'd been warned about eyes, how to shield herself from the glare of too many looks. Yet the gym felt different than home. Here, the rumble of engines became something else, a drumbeat that opened a space rather than closed it. When Diesel finished, the principal called Maya's name and asked her to come forward. Her little feet moved at the speed of heartbeats. She looked at the bikers in the room, the ones who had come to stand like a fence around her. And then she did something she had not done in a long time. She smiled. The children clapped politely as the adults clapped louder, not for spectacle, but for the bravery of a child who had stepped into light. News traveled in small towns differently than the world of headlines. It spread by word of mouth, by the shared surprise of people who saw leather and chrome and realized they had become something more than their jackets. The image of Diesel handing Maya a school-appropriate backpack while Bull took a mud-streaked softball glove to make sure it fit right crossed the local paper and the neighborhood feed. Some called it odd, others called it courage. A local reporter asked the principal if this was a stunt. She said no. This was a community choosing to do the right thing out loud. That afternoon, Diesel and Snake went to see Derek Vance. They did not go as a mob. They went as witnesses, carrying documented concerns and the presence of people who would be noted if they stayed or left. Derek's house was cramped. The furniture looked tired in the way of things that had been promised and then not replaced. He answered the door with a face that had made too many small bargains, anger that could flare, shame that had calcified into indifference. "Your kid's got a mark," Diesel said without preamble. "Stools involved, social services are on notice. We're giving you a chance to fix this properly." Derek narrowed his eyes. "You think you can come and tell me how to run my house?" he barked. Bull, who stood angled like a log that could either burn or hold back wind, stepped forward. He did not shout. He told Derek in a low voice that it was his choice to make, to show up for his daughter and for the systems that could help him keep custody if he made real changes, or to choose silence and watch as the law followed its path. There were consequences listed plainly: restraining orders, loss of custody, legal referrals. There was also a door opened, a temp job with oversight, help with debt, counseling, therapy referrals. It was an offer to rebuild rather than to destroy, paired with the blunt statement that the community would not look away. Derek's fists curled like the closing of a season. He left the porch and, for a moment, the world held its breath. The stallions did not follow him inside. They had learned that the power of presence was more persuasive when not used to humiliate. Their leverage was public knowledge, careful documentation, and a willingness to bring institutions to bear. Back at the clubhouse, Diesel called a lawyer contact, a woman who did defense and sometimes ran pro bono clinics. He arranged for an emergency consult. She agreed to meet that evening with the mother, who was shaken but brave in a different register. The mother, Leah, had been working 2 jobs, caught in a net of bills and fear, uncertain how to fill a day with safe choices. The club arranged childcare while Leah met with the social worker. They drove her to an interview the next morning, smoothing out the plan of a temp agency that had promised to look at her resume. It was small, pragmatic scaffolding to keep erosion from becoming a cliff. Bull paid attention to what Maya needed most, which was not a parade of grand gestures but tiny restorations. A consistent bedtime, someone to sit in the waiting room at the clinic, a person who would insist that her account of hurts be heard without making it her job to be brave. The club worked to be those people. They volunteered to sit in hearings if needed, to bring the muffins and the soft blue sweater when a court date was long. They made sure the principal had an agreed-upon plan. Maya could stay with a trusted aunt if a removal became necessary. Social services would pursue interventions that aimed to reunify only upon real proof of change. When the first wave of paperwork came, calls, forms, signed affidavits, Derek reacted in the way men like him sometimes did, with deflection and a threat to leave town. The club recorded what they could and then let the legal process do the hard lifting. There was a night of high tension when Derek drove his truck past the house slowly, like someone measuring boundaries with glare and exhaust. He parked across the street and then watched. Bull drove over and sat on his porch steps like a statue. He did not wave or yell, he simply sat. Sometimes that was enough. Other times it wasn't. That night it was. Derek drove off the next morning, his absence spoken of in town as a sharp cut of consequence that neither party celebrated. What followed was not cinematic finality, but the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding. Leah's hours at a new temp placement were uneven, but they were regular. Social services placed a temporary protective overlay, a plan that required Derek to engage in court-ordered counseling and keep a distance while Leah and Maya's safety plan was established. The restraining order filed in court was a quiet document whose language was precise and unavoidable. It stood in place like a promise written in ink rather than vows spoken in heat. The stallions kept showing up. They attended meetings, they brought food to the waiting room, they sat on hard plastic chairs at hearings, always careful to be witnesses rather than judges. Diesel taught Maya to balance on the back of a stationary bike, not to ride on the road, but to feel the slight tilt of weight and trust. Bull taught her how to lace up a pair of sneakers tight enough for practice. The small gestures built a bridge between her life at home and a steadier version of a childhood. Word of their intervention spread beyond the neighborhood. Some criticized, others praised. The club's approach, measured, public, and partnered with official channels, became an example in town of what community action could look like. It was not universal salvation. Not everyone who asked for help got it overnight. But in the place where Maya lived, things changed. On an ordinary September evening a year later, the Stallions organized a modest community fair in the schoolyard. There were hot dogs, a makeshift batting cage, and a sign-up sheet for volunteers who would help chaperone after-school programs. Maya, no longer the smallest person in the room, was there with a squad of kids who had learned to wrestle and to cheer. She wore a jacket that fit and a confidence that had been carefully grown. Bull stood by the folding table, watching her. He caught Diesel's eye and nodded. There was mourning in both their faces for things they had lost to become better men, but there was also quiet gratitude for what had been gained, points of contact where a child's life had been kept from tilting into deeper harm. They had not shocked the world with violence or spectacle. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more radical. A group of outsiders chose to be accountable, to use every tool, legal, social, human, to create a container where a little girl could stop asking to be someone else's parent because she had been given back the people who would show up. The town learned, slowly, that protection sometimes meant making noise in the right places and leaving the rest to steady hands. Maya grew into the space left by those choices. She learned to speak up at the PTA meetings, to ask for extra practice time on the school wrestling mat, and to offer a hand to younger kids who looked like they wanted to be brave but weren't sure how. Each year, the Stallions rode up for Career Day, not for applause, but because presence had become a tradition. On the bench beneath the bannered gym, she sat with the group of children and, in a voice that had found its timbre, told the story of the blue sweater, the muffins, and the time a man in leather sat with her in a waiting room until her mother came out smiling. They had not made the world perfect. Derek Vance's absence haunted some conversations. Not everyone found redemption. But systems had turned toward accountability, and Maya's mother had found steadier work. A therapist on the public roster had become someone Maya trusted. Kids at Roosevelt learned that adults could be complicated and still choose to do right. When Maya asked, years later, for permission to have the Stallions at the end-of-year celebration, Diesel hesitated. He was a man who measured consequences. Then he smiled, the small smile of a leader who knows when to risk softness. "Show up," he told her. "That's the only thing that ever mattered." They did. The bikes rolled in as sunset warmed the schoolyard. Children laughed. Parents took photos. Maya stood at the microphone with a voice that carried the truth of what she'd lived through and the hard-won sense that family is not only blood, but the people who show up, day after day, in the small, steady ways that heal. They had been called outsiders. They had become the neighborhood's most unlikely guardians. And in being so, they taught a town that bravery could be a routine, that protection could mean paperwork, presence, and persistence as much as it did muscle. The headline that followed, about bikers answering a little girl's plea, missed the quiet center. The months of court dates, the warm muffins, the mentor who taught a child how to tie sneakers for practice. That was the kind of miracle iron and leather could build. The story didn't end with a single dramatic strike. It kept moving through the ordinary work of repair. But for Maya, a little girl with a black eye who once asked to borrow parents for a day, the world had shifted. She had traded shame for a voice. She had traded fear for a team. And everywhere she looked, at the leather jackets by the school gates, at her mother's steadier step, at the blue sweater that had faded into habit, she saw people who had chosen to be family when family had failed. They'd started with a question at a clubhouse doorway. They'd answered with presence. And in that answering, a small town learned how to keep its children safe.